What confuses the avoidant mind more than anything is not intensity, it's calm unpredictability. They've spent most of their lives learning emotional patterns. When someone gets close, they either cling harder or they create distance. It's almost mechanical. They anticipate reactions, they expect emotional spikes. They're prepared for neediness, for pressure, for the subtle pull of someone trying to secure certainty. And then they encounter you, and your responses don't follow the script. You're present, but not consuming. Interested, but not dependent. You engage, but you don't chase. And that alone creates a kind of psychological friction they're not used to processing. Because when the usual cues are missing, the mind doesn't relax. It leans in. It starts asking questions it can't easily answer. Why aren't they reacting the way others do? Why don't they seem affected in the same way? What is it about them that feels different? That difference is where attraction begins to grow, not out of drama, but out of mystery. See, avoidants are highly attuned to emotional pressure. The moment they sense expectation or urgency, their instinct is to retreat, to protect their independence. But when you operate from a grounded emotional state, when you're not trying to force connection or extract validation, you remove that pressure entirely. And in doing so, you disarm their defenses without ever confronting them directly. What replaces that pressure is something far more powerful: curiosity. Curiosity is subtle, but it's incredibly persuasive. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it. When someone can't predict you, can't categorize you, can't place you into a familiar emotional pattern, they begin to observe you more closely. They start replaying interactions in their mind. They analyze your tone, your pauses, your choices, and without realizing it, they begin investing mental and emotional energy. That's the hook. They're engaged, but they don't fully understand why. And here's where it goes even deeper. Your emotional steadiness doesn't just confuse them, it creates a sense of safety they rarely experience. Not the kind of safety that feels suffocating or binding, but a quiet, non-intrusive presence. You're not trying to control them, not trying to define the relationship prematurely, not trying to close the gap too quickly, and because of that, they don't feel the need to escape. Instead, they stay. They stay long enough to feel something unfamiliar, long enough for their guard to lower just slightly, long enough for their attention to shift from protecting themselves to understanding you. And that shift is critical because for someone who is used to keeping distance, attention is the first form of attachment. But what's important to understand is this isn't about playing games or being emotionally unavailable. It's about alignment. When you're centered in yourself, when your emotional world isn't dependent on their reactions, you naturally become less predictable, not because you're trying to be, but because you're not operating from fear or need. And that authenticity carries weight. It signals that you're not here to fill a void. You're here because you choose to be. And choice, when it's not driven by dependency, has a different energy to it. It's steady, it's controlled, it's grounded. And for the avoidant, that's both disarming and deeply intriguing. They may not be able to articulate it. They may not even consciously recognize it, but they feel it. And what they feel doesn't push them away, it pulls them in. Because when someone can't predict you, can't control the emotional dynamic, and can't find the usual reasons to retreat, they're left with one option: to stay present with the experience. And in that presence, attachment begins, not through force, not through pressure, but through the quiet power of something they can't quite explain. And that's the paradox. What they don't understand is exactly what keeps them coming back. And once that curiosity takes hold, something else begins to register in the avoidant's mind, something even more compelling than mystery. It's the way you carry yourself emotionally. Not what you say, not what you promise, but how you regulate yourself in moments where most people lose control. Because here's what defines the avoidant experience. They are constantly scanning for emotional pressure. They are hyper-aware of shifts in tone, expectation, and dependency. And the moment they sense that someone's emotional state is tied to their behavior, they feel it as a burden, not because they don't care, but because it threatens their sense of autonomy. So when they encounter someone who doesn't hand over that control, someone who feels deeply but doesn't react impulsively, it disrupts their entire framework. You don't chase clarity. You don't escalate tension. You don't try to force emotional resolution in every uncertain moment. Instead, you respond with intention. There's a pause in you, a kind of discipline. And that discipline communicates something far more powerful than words ever could. It communicates self-possession. And to the avoidant, self-possession reads as power. Not dominance, not control over others, but control over self. The ability to experience emotion without being consumed by it. The ability to stay stay grounded when things are unclear. That's rare. And anything rare immediately becomes valuable in the mind of someone who is used to predictable emotional volatility. Think about what they're accustomed to. People reacting quickly, expressing urgency, needing reassurance, seeking immediate validation. There's nothing inherently wrong with those behaviors, but they are familiar. And familiarity doesn't create intrigue, it creates expectation. But when your behavior breaks that expectation, it forces them to reassess. They begin to notice that you're not trying to pull them closer. You're allowing them to come closer on their own terms. You're not demanding consistency. You're observing it. You're not reacting to every shift. You're choosing when and how to engage. And that choice is where your power lies, because it shows that your emotional state isn't dependent on their presence or absence. You're not waiting to feel okay. You already are. You're not looking to them to stabilize you. You're stable on your own. That kind of independence does two things simultaneously. It creates a sense of safety because there's no pressure being placed on them. And it creates a sense of challenge because they can't easily influence you. And the avoidant mind is drawn to both. They feel safe enough to stay, but uncertain enough to become invested. They start to wonder what it would take to affect you more deeply, to be the one who breaks through that calm exterior. And without realizing it, they begin to move towards you. Not because you pulled them in, but because your presence invited them to step forward. There's a subtle shift that happens here. Respect begins to form. And respect in this dynamic is often the precursor to attraction. Because when someone recognizes that you're not easily shaken, not easily influenced, not easily defined, they start to see you differently. You're no longer just another emotional experience. You become someone they have to understand, someone they have to meet at a higher level. But this only works when it's genuine. You can't perform self-control. You can't fake emotional stability for long. It has to come from a place of internal alignment, where your reactions are guided by awareness, not impulse. And when that alignment is real, it becomes undeniable. They may not say it out loud. They may not even fully understand it themselves, but they feel the difference. They feel that you're not trying to manage them. You're managing yourself. And that distinction changes everything, because in a world where most people are trying to control outcomes, the person who controls themselves becomes the most compelling presence in the room. And that's the shift. When your self-control becomes your signal, they stop seeing you as someone to avoid and start seeing you as someone they can't ignore. And as that respect begins to take root, something even more unsettling starts to happen beneath the surface. Something the avoidant doesn't consciously sign up for. They begin to feel a shift in control. Not control over you, but control within themselves. Because up to this point, they've been operating from a familiar position. They manage distance. They regulate closeness. They decide when to lean in and when to pull away. That sense of control is what keeps them comfortable. It's what allows them to engage without feeling overwhelmed. But your presence changes that equation. When you remain steady, when you don't react to their distance with anxiety or pursuit, you remove the levers they're used to pulling. There's no emotional spike for them to respond to, no pressure to escape, no urgency to manage. And without those cues, something unusual happens. They start feeling more than they intended to. Not because you pushed them there, but because nothing interrupted the process. See, most of the time, avoidants don't fully experience their emotions. The moment something deep begins to surface, they create distance. Physically, emotionally, psychologically. It's a protective mechanism. It keeps things from going too far, too fast. It allows them to stay in control of the experience. But when you don't chase, don't collapse, don't react in ways that justify their withdrawal, you quietly remove their exit strategy, and now they're left alone with the very thing they've spent years avoiding, their own emotional depth. At first, it's subtle. A lingering thought, a moment of unexpected reflection. They find themselves thinking about you when they didn't plan to. Replaying conversations, noticing details they would normally dismiss, and they can't quite explain why it's happening because from their perspective, nothing dramatic occurred. That's exactly the point. It's not intensity that's pulling them in, it's continuity. Your consistency, your grounded presence creates a space where emotion can develop without disruption. And that kind of slow, uninterrupted emotional build is unfamiliar territory for someone who is used to cutting things off before they get too real. Now here's where the tension begins, because as those feelings grow, so does a quiet sense of discomfort. Not discomfort with you, but with the loss of control they're starting to experience internally. They can't just switch it off. They can't easily distance themselves without a clear reason. And they can't fully engage without stepping into vulnerability. So they hover, they move closer, then pause. They engage, then retreat slightly. Not because they're playing games, but because they're trying to recalibrate. They're trying to understand why this dynamic feels different, why you're not triggering their usual defenses, yet somehow reaching them more deeply than others have. And what they're really responding to is this: you're not trying to control the connection. That absence of control from your side forces them to confront the illusion of control on theirs, because control, for them, has always been about managing distance. But now, distance isn't solving the problem, it's amplifying it. The more they step back, the more they notice your absence. The more they try to detach, the more they realize they're already attached in ways they didn't anticipate. And that realization is what hooks them. Not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, but in a quiet, persistent way that doesn't go away easily. It lingers, it builds, it challenges their identity as someone who doesn't get too involved. And suddenly, they're involved. Not because you forced it, not because you convinced them, but because your behavior created an environment where their usual defenses had nothing to push against. And without resistance, emotion found its way through. And that's the deeper truth most people miss. It's not about making them feel more, it's about removing the patterns that allow them to feel less. Because when someone who is used to controlling their emotional exposure begins to feel without interruption, they don't just notice the connection, they begin to question their own limits. And that's the moment everything changes. Because the strongest hook is not desire alone. It's the realization that they're no longer in control of how deeply they feel. And as they begin to grapple with that internal loss of control, another shift emerges. One that challenges the very structure they rely on in relationships. It's the shift in power, and more specifically, their inability to define it the way they're used to. Avoidants are most comfortable in dynamics where there's a clear emotional imbalance. Not necessarily in a manipulative sense, but in a way that allows them to maintain distance while the other person leans in. When someone depends on them more, needs them more, or seeks their validation, it gives them a subtle upper hand. It allows them to engage without feeling exposed. But your independence disrupts that entire framework. You're not looking to them to complete your emotional state. You're not structuring your life around their presence. You're not waiting for their messages to determine your mood or your direction. You have your own rhythm, your own priorities, your own sense of purpose, and it exists with or without them. And that's where the disruption begins, because now they can't locate the usual leverage points. There's no clear sign of dependency, no obvious indication that you need more than you're receiving. And without that, they can't default to their familiar role. They can't position themselves at a safe emotional distance while still feeling in control of the connection. Instead, something unfamiliar happens. They begin to question where they stand. They notice that your attention isn't constant, but it's intentional. When you engage, you're present. When you step back, it's not reactive. It's natural. You're not withdrawing to create a reaction, and you're not leaning in to secure one. You're simply moving in alignment with your own life. And that alignment is what makes you unpredictable in the most grounded way, because you're not reacting to them. You're responding to yourself. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Now the avoidant, who is used to observing others for signs of need or expectation, finds themselves in a position where those signals are absent. And without those signals, they can't rely on their usual strategies. They can't create distance to regain control, because distance doesn't produce the same effect anymore. It doesn't shift your behavior. It doesn't pull you closer. It simply exists, and so do you. And that's where the reversal begins. They start to pay closer attention, not because you demanded it, but because they have to. They're trying to understand how you operate, what drives your engagement, what influences your presence. And in doing so, they begin investing energy in a way they're not accustomed to. You're no longer orbiting around them. They're orienting themselves around you. Now, this doesn't mean they suddenly become expressive or emotionally available overnight. The avoidant pattern doesn't dissolve that quickly, but internally, something has shifted. The dynamic is no longer one-sided. The sense of control they once relied on is no longer clearly defined. And that ambiguity creates tension, because for someone who values independence, encountering another person who embodies it at a high level is both disarming and compelling. They recognize it, they respect it, and at the same time, they feel the pull to understand it more deeply. You become a reference point, not because you asked to be, but because your behavior reflects a level of self-sufficiency they can't easily categorize. And here's the deeper layer. Your independence doesn't push them away. It gives them space to come closer without losing themselves. That's the paradox. When you don't require them to show up in a specific way, when you don't place expectations that feel restrictive, they experience a kind of freedom within the connection, and that freedom reduces the need to escape. It lowers their defenses. It allows them to stay engaged longer than they typically would. But at the same time, your independence ensures that the connection doesn't revolve around them. And that's what ultimately shifts the balance. Because now, they're not just participating, they're pursuing understanding. They're not just maintaining distance, they're navigating proximity. And in that process, they begin to invest in ways that feel unfamiliar, but increasingly significant. Not because they lost power to you, but because your independence made power irrelevant. And when power is no longer the focus, connection becomes the only thing left to explore. And that's where the dynamic truly changes. When they realize they're not leading the connection anymore. They're following something they can't quite define, but don't want to lose. And as they move deeper into that experience, no longer trying to control it, no longer able to define it in familiar terms, something even more personal begins to surface. It's not just about how you make them feel. It's about what you represent. Because at a certain point, the avoidant isn't just observing your behavior, they're comparing it to their own internal world. They start to notice the contrast. You remain composed in moments where they would normally withdraw. You express without overextending. You connect without losing yourself. And while they may not articulate it directly, there's a quiet recognition forming in the background. You operate in a way they haven't fully mastered, and that recognition carries weight. Avoidants often pride themselves on independence, but their version of independence is protective. It's built around distance, around minimizing vulnerability, around staying in control. What they encounter in you is a different kind of independence, one that doesn't require emotional shutdown, one that allows for connection without compromise. And that difference is both disarming and deeply attractive, because on some level, they begin to see in you a version of themselves that they haven't yet become. Not a perfect version, not an idealized image, but a more integrated one. Someone who can hold emotional depth and personal stability at the same time. Someone who doesn't have to choose between closeness and autonomy. And that realization creates a subtle form of admiration. Now, admiration in this context doesn't always look obvious. It's not always expressed through words or direct acknowledgement. In fact, it often shows up indirectly, through increased attention, through a heightened awareness of your presence, through moments where they seem more engaged than usual, even if they don't fully explain why. Because what they're responding to isn't just attraction, it's alignment with something they value but haven't fully accessed. You become a reference point for what's possible. And here's where it deepens. When someone sees in you a quality they respect but don't fully embody, it creates a natural pull toward growth, not in a forced or conscious way, but in a quiet internal shift. They start adjusting, even slightly. They become more present, more consistent, more aware of how they show up. Not because you ask them to, but because your presence sets a standard. And standards, when they're lived rather than spoken, have a unique kind of influence. You're not telling them how to behave. You're not setting rules or expectations. You're simply being who you are, grounded, self-aware, emotionally balanced. And that consistency creates a mirror, one that reflects both who they are and who they could become. And for someone who has spent years avoiding that kind of reflection, it's powerful. It challenges them, but it doesn't threaten them. It invites them, but it doesn't pressure them. And that balance is what allows the connection to evolve without resistance. Because now the dynamic is no longer just about emotional safety or curiosity. It's about meaning. They begin to associate you with a deeper experience, one that feels different from their past connections, less reactive, less chaotic, more intentional. And in that difference, they start to assign value. Not just to the connection, but to you as an individual. You're no longer someone they're trying to figure out. You're someone they're trying to understand on a deeper level. Someone whose presence has impact, even in silence. Someone who influences them without trying to. And that influence is what makes the attachment more complex, because it's no longer driven by surface-level attraction or temporary intrigue. It's rooted in something more stable: respect, admiration, and a quiet desire to be closer to the way you move through the world. And that's not something they can easily walk away from, because when someone doesn't just make you feel something, but shows you something about yourself, the connection becomes harder to ignore. And that's the shift. When you stop being just a person in their life and start becoming a reflection of who they could be, they don't just feel drawn to you. They feel compelled to stay close to what you represent. And when all of these shifts begin to stack, curiosity, respect, loss of control, admiration, something very precise starts to happen in the dynamic. the investment begins to reverse. Not because you demanded it, not because you engineered it, but because of what you chose not to do. You stop chasing. Now, this is often misunderstood. People hear "don't chase" and interpret it as withdrawal, silence, or playing hard to get. But that's not what's happening here. What changes is your orientation. You're no longer pursuing the person. You're grounded in your own direction. You're engaged, but you're not attached to the outcome. And that distinction is everything, because for the avoidant, pursuit has always been the signal to create distance. The more someone leans in with urgency, the more they feel the need to pull back to regain space. It's not a conscious rejection. It's a reflex, a way to maintain emotional equilibrium. But when that pressure disappears, when no one is trying to close the gap faster than it naturally unfolds, the entire system resets. There's nothing to resist. And without resistance, the avoidant doesn't move away. They remain where they are. And in that stillness, something subtle but powerful begins to emerge. Awareness of absence. They start to notice when you're not there, not in a dramatic, anxious way, but in a quiet, persistent way that builds over time. The conversation that didn't happen, the message that didn't arrive, the presence that isn't being offered as consistently as before. Not because you're withholding, but because you're no longer overextending. And that space does something important. It invites them to step in, because now, if they want connection, they have to initiate it. If they want your attention, they have to move toward it. And that movement, even if it starts small, begins to shift their role in the dynamic. They go from responding to reaching. And that's where investment is born. Investment isn't created by what you give. It's created by what someone chooses to contribute. Time, attention, effort, thought, these are the building blocks of attachment. And when the avoidant begins to offer them voluntarily, without pressure, it carries a different kind of weight, because now it's coming from them. They're not reacting to your pursuit. They're acting on their own interests. They're not managing your expectations. They're following their own curiosity. And that internal motivation is far more sustainable than anything external. But here's the deeper layer. As they begin to invest, they also begin to value not just the connection, but the access to you. Because your attention is no longer constant, it's intentional. It's something they experience when there's alignment, not something that's always available regardless of behavior. And that creates a natural sense of significance around the interaction. They start to recognize that being close to you isn't automatic. It's earned through presence, through consistency, through mutual engagement. And that realization changes how they show up. They become more attentive, more responsive, more aware of the impact of their actions. Not because you ask them to change, but because the dynamic now requires participation. And participation leads to attachment. Because the more someone invests, the more they associate themselves with the outcome. The more they show up, the more they care about what happens. And the more they care, the harder it becomes to detach without consequence. That's the shift. You didn't convince them to stay. You created the conditions where staying became their choice. You didn't ask for more. You allowed them to give more. And in doing so, you transformed the connection from something they could manage into something they actively experience. And once someone begins to experience a connection they helped build, it's no longer just about you. It's about what they've put into it. And people don't walk away easily from what they've invested in. So in the end, it's not about pulling them closer. It's about creating enough space for them to step forward on their own. Because the moment they choose to move toward you, without pressure, without prompting, that's the moment the dynamic truly shifts. And that's the truth most people overlook. The strongest connections are never chased. They are chosen. When you step back and look at the entire dynamic, a clear pattern begins to emerge. Nothing you've done relied on force, persuasion, or manipulation. There were no games, no strategies designed to trap someone emotionally. What created the shift was far more fundamental and far more powerful. It was the way you showed up. You brought consistency where there is usually chaos. You brought self-control where there is usually reaction. You brought independence where there is usually dependency. And without ever saying it out loud, you introduced a new standard for connection, one that doesn't rely on pressure to create closeness. And that's what changed everything, because the avoidant didn't feel pushed, they felt pulled. Not by intensity, not by demand, but by the absence of everything they're used to defending against. No pressure to perform, no urgency to define, no expectation to meet something they weren't ready for. And in that space, something rare happened. They stayed. They stayed long enough to feel, long enough to question their patterns, long enough to experience connection without the instinct to escape. And in doing so, they became part of something they didn't fully understand, but didn't want to lose. That's the paradox at the center of all of this. The more grounded you became, the more they leaned in. The less you chased, the more they invested. The more you remained aligned with yourself, the harder it became for them to walk away. Not because you changed them, but because you removed the conditions that allowed them to stay the same. And that's where the real power lies. Because this was never about controlling another person's behavior. It was about mastering your own. It was about becoming so internally stable, so clear in your presence that the dynamic had no choice but to evolve around you. And when you reach that point, something shifts permanently. You stop asking, like, how do I make them stay? And you start realizing the right ones won't want to leave.